Greetings, everyone. Brett here with Hammerhead Model Making. And I believe an episode that you're all really looking forward to is finally here. This is the Revell 148 scale B-1B Lancer. Now, to give you a little context for this build, I actually started this build more than a decade ago. I've had this kit in my possession for many, many years. And I had started it and realized that my skills were not quite prepared to deal with this kit. And additionally, I didn't have anywhere to put it when it was done. It's huge. It is a huge kit. It's 36 inches nose to tail. It's very large. And so I boxed it up and I shelved it until I felt like I was ready. And in the meantime, I acquired some aftermarket things because I quickly realized that the Revell kit is somewhat lacking in terms of making a modern B1. So here you can see some of the work that I had previously done. And it's definitely rough. It's interesting going back and looking at work that I did a decade ago and seeing how far I've progressed since then. Now, there are a few things in here where I'm like, okay, that wasn't actually too bad. You can see they're actually attempted to do some belts on those seats. But also at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that I was just not very good at. So this build is going to be kind of fun because A, I'm finishing a kit that I started 10 years ago, but also B, like I get to improve on my previous work. I think about the only thing that I did do that I'm actually proud of how I did it was the wheels. There was almost no seam line on the wheels. And so I'm impressed that 10-year younger me was able to do that. But the rest of it, you can see it's pretty rough. So I had to start out with trying to disassemble as much as I could safely without breaking parts and then cleaning up what I couldn't. And so you have to understand this was built using Tester's tube glue. I wasn't even aware that Tamiya Extra Thin or any kind of liquid cement existed. As far as I knew, it was just tube glue and that was it. And that actually kind of worked in my favor a little bit because it just wasn't a very strong bond. So many of the parts I was able to remove or at least get removed enough that I could, clean it up and make the parts fit better. And so really the first step was just to kind of get everything clean, get everything ready so that I could start repainting and repair some of the earlier damage that I did. So I'm going to... There's a lot of parts that actually warped as well while in the box, sitting on the shelf in my garage for 10 years. And so I do kind of have to just deal with that. So one of the things that I was like, okay, I'm not going to worry about super detailing certain aspects of this kit just because I know that they would never be seen. So one of the things that I'm not going to I'm not going to worry too much about is the cockpit. The cockpit is rather difficult to see, especially the back portion, because there's only these two tiny little windows and there's just no way you're going to see into it. And so really my goal here was to get it assembled and painted into a way that would, that would be okay, but not necessarily super detailing and worrying about crazy accuracy, because really the cockpit needs a lot of work to make it accurate to a modern B1. And so that was just something I wasn't concerned about with this build. This was more just about I wanted to get the build built, finally get this one done, and be able to happily look at it in my display case. So here, because I started doing belts on one seat, I figured I would at least finish the other 3 seats with some belts. I'm just using some masking tape just to match what I had originally done. And now I'm going to go ahead and give everything on the interior a nice good coat of Mr. Surface, the Aqueous primer, and get that all nice and ready for painting. I've really taken to the Aqueous primer. I like using it. I feel like it has all of the same benefits as Mr. Surfacer, but I feel like it's just a little bit easier, at least for me, to use, and I'm not quite as sensitive to thinning ratios and overspray and getting that weird if you're spraying into a corner where you get atomization on another. Anyways, I just find it is easier for me to work with, and I've been really enjoying it. So we're just going to go ahead and get everything primed. I'm priming over the original paint I did. I'm not going to worry about stripping any paint here. It's just not worth the time. Like I said, you're not going to see much of this. And so we're just going to go ahead and get that all done. It's interesting that all props to Revell. They added a lot of detail to this, especially in the like the nose landing gear wheel well, that I don't find even on modern kits. Like there's wires and plumbing and junction boxes and all kinds of detailing that you wouldn't like. That really surprises me how well detailed it is. And then you have like the cockpit, and the cockpit's pretty simple. It's like, that's okay. And then like the main wheel well is really simple. So it's interesting the choices that they made when doing this kit. And I know this kit's been around for a long time, so I mean it's not like it's definitely not a modern tooled kit. It's pretty old, but still. And the thing is, like, the detail on like the instrument panel and stuff is actually really nice. It's nice and raised. It's got a great contrast and profile, so it looks nice just from like a painting standpoint, but not necessarily like super accurate. But it still is somewhat easy to paint and build up, or like detail out from some simple painting techniques. So here I'm just going to paint all the instrument consoles black. And one of the things when I'm painting, so I'm using Vallejo black here, just straight, Vallejo model color black. And I've found that you do have to thin the Vallejo paints just a little bit with some water. You can just use tap water in order to get them to really flow nice. But it's a really fine line between over thinning and under thinning. And it really just kind of comes from time and experience of just being able to do that. But I find that it goes on really easily. Then we're going to have everything with a dry brush just to kind of pick out some of that nice raised detail and just create a little bit of texture on the surfaces of everything. And so here you can see I'm kind of going black over everything. And I also hand painted the non-slip stuff on the floor there. Here I am doing this is like a really dark black green for the instrument, like the actual like display screens. I didn't necessarily want to try and display this in the powered on position like I had previously. So I'm just going with a really dark green here. Here we're going to paint up the seats. I love the red on these seats just because it helps add like a little bit of color to just basically an otherwise like gigantic gray blob. And again, you won't see much of the interior, but you will see a little bit of these red seats through the windows, even though the windows are technically tinted. Revell does provide you with a black tinted, or kind of a really, really dark black and brown tinted window, which is kind of nice. You don't have to worry about doing it yourself, and it's not bad. I think it looks pretty good. So now we're just going to hit everything with a little bit of panel liner. This will just help create some contrast between the details and the surrounding gray paint. So we're just going to go over everything. Nothing really, this is nothing very difficult, just a little time consuming, but fortunately the little brush on the panel liner applicator works pretty good and makes the job relatively simple. The brush is fine enough that like you can really like get accurate where you want to put it. But now we're going to hit with some odorless thinner. This takes you have to put it on a little bit, not really flood the area, but like apply it to the area you want to clean up first. Let it sit for like 10-15 seconds, and then you can wipe up the excess and clean up the areas that you don't want the wash or the pin wash on. And it's just a matter of going around getting it all done. Nothing terribly. Again, these are all things you've seen me do before. I did want to create a little bit of a glass effect on the instrument screens here, so I'm using some clear UV curing resin. So I'm just applying it with a brush, an old brush. It's hard to get this stuff cleaned up out of the brush once it's on there. So if you're going to do this, make sure you're using an old brush and get this applied onto all the screens. And then once I'm ready, I just go stick it under my UV lamp that I use for curing my 3D prints, and it hardens right up. So, literally it takes 15 seconds under the UV lamp and it's rock solid. So now we can get a little bit of assembly going on here with the cockpit, get everything kind of put back together. You will notice I originally cut off the locating tabs for the seats, mainly just because things had warped a little bit sitting in the box, and so they didn't quite, the seats ended up like pigeon-toed in there. It just didn't look very good. So it's just easier to cut off the tabs and just position them by hand. Now, when I was looking up images for reference pictures for the B1 of how I wanted to do the overall paint job, I came across a couple of pictures of B1s in flight, usually taken from the perspective of aerial refueling tanker looking down onto the cockpit, where they had draped an American flag over the instrument combing. And I thought that'd be a really fun detail and a really great way to add some more color to the aircraft. And so here I'm just using a little sheet of lead foil as my flag and draping it over the instrument combing here. So the reason why I'm using the lead foil as opposed to like tissue or something is, one, it's very smooth, but because of the nature of the lead foil, it allows you to create some nice like drapes and folds that feel cloth-like, I'll say. It's not perfect, and I'm sure if I had the time and patience, I could have used like a two-part epoxy putty to do this, and it would have been even a little bit more realistic, but I'm pretty happy with how it's looking. So I'm going to tack it on with one corner with some super glue. And then, so I'll get that tacked onto one corner of the instrument combing and then slowly work my way around, applying more super glue here and getting exactly how I want. I definitely wanted to have some visible folds in there and creases and wrinkles just to give it that appearance. So it took a little bit of work to get that manipulated correctly, but I'm happy with how it turned out. And so here I'm just using these tweezers here to create some artificial folds and wrinkles. Just give it a little bit of character and not make it so like one-dimensional flat object on the instrument combing. Because in the pictures, that's not what it looked like. And I'll have a picture later on in the video so you can get an idea of, what I was referencing when I decided to do this. But it was just a great way to help add a little bit of visual interest to the aircraft and create a little bit of a breakup with the overall, monotone color. So now I'm going to start painting the flag. For this, I'm just using Vallejo acrylics, and we're going to start with a base coat of white. I didn't bother priming the flag. I could have used like a brush-on primer, but I knew once the cockpit was closed up, nothing was going to be touching this or rubbing against it, so I wasn't worried about the paint coming off. It took a couple of coats of the white to get on there and really like cover up the lead foil, but once I was done, it was on there good. So here you can just see that was coat one, and then I think I added about 2 coats in total. So not too bad, or 3 coats in total, sorry, not too bad. So now we're going to paint the blue field that the white stars will go on. And now this isn't going to be like the most perfect, accurate representation of American flag. So it's going to be close for being hand painted. And in a lot of the pictures I saw, the flag was actually folded in half widthwise. So you won't see like the full 13 stripes, things like that. So it'll look close, it'll look decent. I think it'll convey what it's supposed to be. So now we can start doing the red stripes and layering that on. So again, these are all just Vallejo paints, pretty easy to use. I mean, when it comes to brush painting, it's always Vallejo for me. I almost never use anything else. And here's the completed flag. I apologize I didn't have full footage of the flag, but again, pretty happy with how it turned out. I like it, and adds a great little splash of color to the cockpit. So now we can move on to the nose landing gear and the nose landing gear well. So like I said earlier, there's a lot of detail in here. It's actually really nice, like really raised, lots of sharp relief. But the nose landing gear, leaves a little something to be desired. There are a few improvements we can make on this. So the first thing I'm going to do is start drilling out the holes in this support arm. And because that's how it is on the real thing. And it's drilling out things like this. And I do this like on Spitfires and wherever you can find a place to like drill holes like that. I think it adds a huge amount of detail with very little effort. And so I always try to find places where I can do that and add that kind of detail because it's pretty simple. And those drill bits, you can find them on Amazon for like $15. They're pretty inexpensive and they'll last you a while. Another thing here, so what I'm doing right now is grinding out the insides of the landing lights or the landing taxi lights. So one of the things that, because this kit sat in my garage for so long, I did lose a couple of parts, and some of those parts were clear parts like the landing light lenses. So I decided I was going to to grind them out, make them much more realistic, and then use the UV curing resin to create new lenses. Another thing I had to do when I dismantled the nose landing gear, I accidentally broke the axle for it's got 2 wheels, so I had to fabricate a new one, and I'm just using bits of sprue from the kit itself. And because the sprue is a little bit larger in diameter compared to the original axle, obviously I have to drill it out a little bit, but in the end this actually ends up working out better because this is a very large model and it is quite heavy, and the original axle that those wheels would have sat on was pretty narrow. So I think in the end this will help just beef up the landing gear just a little bit and make it just that much more durable. So it worked out that the sprue itself from the kit had just the right diameter, and I was able to make it work. And kind of happy with my little DIY fix here, and I think it works out. So it's mainly just a matter of like measuring and figuring out how much I needed to remove from here, using some clippers in order to get the wheels to sit correctly on the landing gear. You'll also notice that the nose gear can actually swivel. Obviously you could just glue it in place, but I kind of like the idea of being able to leave it free to swivel, and because it helps me if I'm, if I have it out on the display case or if I take it to a show, that I can, create a little bit of posing for it. One aspect that I knew that I wanted to do some scratch building was the crew entry ladder. So what you see here is what the kit offers you, and it's really rudimentary and not really a good representation of the actual crew ladder. And fortunately, there is a B-1B on display not too far from where I live that has the ladder open. So I was able to go and take some pictures, good reference pictures of what the ladder looks like, in order to essentially scratch build a new ladder. So I have a general philosophy when it comes to doing scratch building projects of this nature, and I touch upon it a little bit in my A26 video. But basically it's the idea that using simple shapes to build up more complex objects. And what I mean by that is you can often create detail by like layering and combining basic squares, rectangles, circles, triangles, things like that. And so really what I hope you can learn from this segment of the video is that scratch building, while it can be intimidating at first, once you can start visualizing how to break things down into simple shapes, it becomes so much easier and so much more accessible. And so I'm taking something that's somewhat complex, like the boarding ladder of a B1, and we're going to break it down into simple shapes here. So I've got a basic rectangle for, the outer surface of the door. And basically I just copied the kit part in terms of like the size and dimension. And now we're just using strips of plastic, and this is going to start building up the sides of the ladder. And so it's something I believe is very accessible, even to people that might be like beginning scale modelers, new to the hobby, things like that. And so I encourage you just to give it a try. And you can start out with simple things like just a little rectangle of plastic and like a little piece of wire coming out of it can add a lot of detail to like a cockpit, for example, little like a junction box or something like that. And it's easy. It literally would take you 30 seconds to do. So just be aware that this is a lot more accessible than it might initially look or feel. So right now I have to create holes in the structure here. And so I'm using a really small drill bit to create a pilot hole that I can then use the larger drill bit to actually create the overall hole. And I find that drilling the pilot hole first makes it easier to maintain like the right position for the larger drill bit. So now we're going to attach these side rails to the outer skin here, just using the Tamiya extra thin to get that applied on. Now, in terms of the material that I use, generally I am using evergreen styrene. Now, I can easily go over to my hobby shop and pick this up. They have a rack full of it, various different sizes, thicknesses, profiles, strips, rods, and sheets, clear, textured, all these things for relatively inexpensive. But you can also order them online from various hobby shops, including mrshobby.com. But you can even get evergreen styrene at places like Hobby Lobby. They'll sell some, things like that. Craft stores might have it as well. So just be aware that it might be easier to acquire than you might think. But at the very least, you can find it online. And it's my go-to when it comes to scratch building material. But also you can find just things around the house can make good scratch building material. Like if you ever buy something that comes in one of those plastic clamshells, that plastic can make good scratch building material. Things like foil off of wine bottles, that makes good scratch building material. Old electronics, don't throw them out. Pull them apart, take out all the wires. That makes good scratch building material. You can find scratch building material just about anywhere. And I've seen some people get really creative with the type of scratch building materials they get. So again, definitely recommend giving this a try. So now I'm just adding a little bit of this little top rail to the parts we've already done. And again, so I am working off of reference pictures that I both took and found online to try and get this close to accurate and as a good representation of what the ladder is supposed to look like. This is pretty much the one area that I'm focusing on in terms of scratch building, because it would have been cool to have like all the bomb bays opened up but they would need so much work. Same thing with like having the wings out with all the slats and flaps dropped. It looks great, but it's just so much work. And for me, this build was more about just getting it done as opposed to making it like the most impressive thing ever. So here you can see I kept the handrails from the original kit part. Those are the only parts that I used from the original kit, just because that would have been something that would have been difficult, but not impossible to scratch build. And now I'm adding these little support braces on the side. So again, so far all we've been using, are rectangles and strips of plastic, and that's it. So now we're using some triangles, and this will create a little bit of texture on the side and create that support structure that they have. So there you can see it looks pretty good. Again, so we've just been using triangles, rectangles, and now we're using more rectangles to do the steps. Although we are doing a little bit of a cutout here. So the way that the steps work is you have like the section that I've been working on has these folding steps, and then inside these little grooves that I'm cutting out runs another section of the ladder that extends out. And so as the ladder retracts down, these steps will fall into place and be parallel to the ground. But as you push the extendable part back up into the ladder, these steps all flap up and become perpendicular to the actual ladder structure itself. And so that was important to represent the look and design of these steps, because it's going to be fairly prominent when you're looking at the completed model, especially because the whole nose of the jet is going to be somewhat of a focal point, and I wanted the boarding ladder to look good. So here we're getting these installed in, again, at roughly the correct angle, so the ladder will be deployed at like almost a 45-degree angle, so those steps need to be canted in the opposite direction. And so now I'm doing the extended part of the ladder, and again, we're just using rectangle shapes of plastic. And now, granted, the boarding ladder of the B1 is relatively simple when it comes to its overall shape and dimensions. So, this definitely could be more complex with a different shape, but for the purposes of what I'm trying to demonstrate here, I think it does a pretty good job. So getting it all aligned was a little iffy. I'm sure I could have made like a little jig to do this on, but in the end, I got where I needed to go, and you'll see here how it just slides up into place. So now you can imagine on the real thing, if you'd keep pushing that up, it would hit it would hit each one of those steps on the way up and hinge them up. So now that we've done our scratch building, now we've gotten all of our nose, landing gear, and everything prepared, it's time to start painting everything. And again, we're going back to the aqueous primer, get everything primed up. And you might be asking yourself, Brett, if everything's going to get painted white, why are you priming it black? And that's a good question, because they do make white primers. You can get a white primer and easily prime this all white. But I find that, at least for me, what works best is, the first thing is giving everything a uniform base coat. So everything on the aircraft is starting from the same color. That just helps keep consistency in the build. Additionally, having a black primer, even when painting white over it, does allow me to at least the option of creating artificial shadow. So, for example, I could just not paint the white as full as I would, and it would help create some artificial shadow in there. I have the option. I can play around with that if I need to. Ultimately, I pretty much just go straight paint and don't worry about creating any artificial shadow. But the fact that I have the option is something that I like having. It's kind of like a peace of mind for me to know, and that I have the ability to kind of make changes on the fly depending on how I think it's looking. So now we're going to go ahead and give everything a nice good white coat, and pretty much everything in the nose gets painted white. And it's an American military aircraft. That's just I should say modern military aircraft. That's just how they are. And so for this, I'm just using the Tamiya XF1 white color. In my opinion, one of the better whites to use. It's easy to thin. It sprays on nice, and it has good coverage. I mean, I've painted other white paints, Vallejo, Ammo, MiG, things like that aren't bad, but they just don't have like that nice big coverage that the Tamiya color has. Plus, when I'm doing large areas, it just makes it a little bit easier. So we're doing some accent painting, some detail painting, and now we're going to hit everything with our panel liner. So we're just giving everything a good, nice coat of the panel liner, really trying to get into all those nooks and crannies and create some nice, relief and contrast with all the detail. Eventually, this is, we'll clean this up like we did in the cockpit, but I don't often use the Tamiya panel liner. This was a little bit of an experience to see if it was something that I could actually figure out. And I know that might kind of sound weird because people use it all the time with great results, but I've always struggled with removing it, but I've been using this enamel thinner to remove it, for the Ammo MiG enamel thinner that I showed earlier, and it works really good now, and it's something that I'm considering using more often in my builds. Although I try to avoid doing straight black as a panel liner or like a wash. But, every now and then it just does work. So here I'm just hand painting the no slip tread on the boarding ladder. I probably could have done some really complicated masking and masked it off and painted it, but I wasn't worried about getting it perfect just because the pictures that I saw online, they weren't perfect. And here's a good demonstration on how I paint tires. I don't often mask off and paint tires. If there's a good lip to the rim of the tire, I find it just faster and easier to paint it by hand. And what I'm using here is the Vallejo black paint that I was using earlier, and I've thinned this out a little bit more than I normally would because what I want is the thinned paint to run into that corner between the lip and the tire and create a nice, good, solid demarcation. And I use this for doing tank tracks or road wheels on tanks and things like that. And as long as there's a prominent lip, it usually works pretty good. And because these tires were pretty large in 48 scale, that also made it easier as well. So now we're going to do a little bit of paint chipping and detailing and on the ladder. And we get interrupted at this point. So if you've seen some of my other videos, you'll know that I do own cats, and they will occasionally visit me while I am working. And in this particular occasion, this is our cat Onyx. He just was really interested in the camera and wanted to know what was going on. So I hope you don't mind this intermission. Like I said, this is going to be a long video, and here's your chance to take a break, go get yourself a drink, bite to eat maybe, and enjoy Onyx's interruption here. But moving on, so I initially did some chipping with a brush to give me a little bit more control over exactly where the chipping was going, and now I can do a little bit more random chipping using a sponge. So I'm just using like a steel color to do the chipping here. From what I could tell, the boarding ladders would get pretty beat up just from the flight crew going up and down, the ground crew going up and down, and you know, if it's extended, it's probably getting knocked and bumped by things. So there was a fair amount of wear and tear on the boarding ladders that I could see from pictures. So we're doing the steel color here, and now I'm going to hit the treads with some white color. So basically the non-slip tread, you know, it's worn down enough that the white paint is showing out underneath it, just not enough into the steel paint, or like to the steel material. So it just kind of helps create this like dual layer of chipping. And now we're going to just add a little bit of oil paints here just to kind of dirty it up. The flight crew's boots and the ground crew's boots would pick up residue off the tarmac and dirt and grease and, you know, whatever fluids B1s leak, and tracked it up the ladder here. Additionally, around the mechanism that would extend and lower the ladder, there would be some buildup of grime there. So just adding a little bit of the weathering just kind of helps create a nice, you know, lived-in look. And I think it turned out pretty good. I'm pretty happy with how the effect turned out. So moving on to the nose gear, I'm using some Molotow liquid chrome to line the inside of the landing lights. And this will help create this nice like reflective surface on the inside. And this stuff, I know you can get like specific refills for this that come in like little, for lack of a better word, a jar. And I really need to look into getting one of those, because trying to get this out of the pen can be kind of a pain. But so everything's been painted. Everything's been, you know, it has the panel liner, and we're ready to seal it all in with a matte coat. This will protect all of our paintwork and allow us to move on to some of the next steps. So we're just going to go ahead and get everything. So I have thinned the matte coat with X20A thinner by Tamiya, and it's roughly about 30% thinner, 70% matte coat. And that actually helps cut the matte coat down just a little bit, so it's not super dead flat. I'd like to have just a little bit of a shine left, and so I find that's a good ratio to do that with. So here we're just rebuilding the wheel well, and so it's got the two compartments. You got the front compartment that has the actual wheel itself, and the back compartment has the crew ladder. And like I mentioned before, here I am using the UV curing resin to create the lenses for the landing lights, and I'm literally just plopping it directly in from the bottle. And because of the viscosity of this stuff, it creates that curved dome effect just on its own. So pretty happy with how that turned out. And now the last thing I wanted to do for the nose wheel well is create the the polished effect of the oleo strut. And so for this, I am using just regular household aluminum foil and cut into a strip. You know, that would be the correct size for the strut here. And now initially I had tried cutting this with my hobby knife, and let me tell you, that's not a good idea. It just tears, even with a brand new blade. And it didn't take me long to realize that scissors were a slightly better option for cutting aluminum foil. So tip for you, use scissors to cut aluminum foil, not a hobby knife. But I am applying it with super glue. That's what I'm using to tack it down, and then just using a brush and the knife to get it into the areas that I need. I wanted to avoid using the knife as much as possible because I didn't want to scratch or otherwise, you know, create blemishes on the surface. But again, Simple effect, but I like how it looks. And, you know, it's real metal, so it looks like real metal. I did get one little crease in there, but I don't think anyone will notice. Now we can get the wheels assembled on using our makeshift axle there. And again, because I used the kit plastic, it just glues on nicely. I also sanded down the wheels to give them that flat spot. And really, really happy with how the nose gear turned out. So another area where this kit is kind of a letdown are the windows. They're rather thick and really softly molded, so they don't have like good sharp edges and corners that fit well. You can see here there's a large gap in the eyebrow window up there, you know, like that it sits down below the level of the plastic. And when you look at pictures of B1s, you'll notice just how like smooth and blended in the main canopy is. And so I knew that I would have to do a lot of work to get this area to look decent. And I knew that was going to mean a lot of sanding and polishing of plastic. So the first step you have to do is you have to separate the side window from the eyebrow window. That helps it sit in much better. But still, it's not perfect. So what my plan here was to do the side windows first, get them all blended in, and then once I got the whole nose section put together, then I would blend in the main front canopy. And this is another thing, just like scratch building, doing sanding clear parts is very intimidating. And it took me a long time before I built up the courage to start sanding clear parts. But now that I've done it, I feel much better about it. I feel much more confident about it, and you can get good results. So I'm going to show you my process here. It's going to be somewhat lengthy, but bear with me. I think the results will be worth it. So I'm starting out with a fairly rough grit. I believe this is like 300 or like 250 or 300 grit sandpaper. And really the purpose of using this like low grit sandpaper is really just to grind everything down to make it nice and flat and even. So this is really shaping our profile here, trying to get the clear part as flush with the rest of the plastic as possible. And so you can see I'm going to town with this and really trying to make sure that and a lot of this you have to do by feel, right? Like if you run your fingers over the sanded area, you'll feel if there's, you know, raised spots or lowered spots, things like that. But you can see I've pretty much gotten this all nice and blended down so that the actual clear part matches the surface. And now using that same sandpaper, I'm going to wet sand it. So wet sanding is one of the keys to doing clear plastic properly. The wet sanding helps in the polishing process, and even like just using this grit sandpaper dry and then using it wet like really changes things, and it kind of helps create like almost like a polishing paste when you do that, which helps in the process. Another thing that's good to do is, like I'm doing here, is to wipe it down in between sandpapers just so you're removing excess grit. And now I'm using 1500 grit, so this is a fairly smooth sandpaper, and doing this wet, and this is going to start the polishing process. So this is really going to help eliminate all of like the gouges and the sanding texture, and really be our first layer of polishing. So again, pretty much everything from here on out is going to be done wet, no more dry sanding at all. And it takes time, you know. I mean, I'm probably doing 10 or 15 minute sessions each for each grit that I do, but it's really what's going to help get this thing looking really nice in the end. And again, it's one of those things where like it's going to look bad up until the very end. So now I have a series of polishing pads, and I picked these up at a hobby shop, and I wish I recall the manufacturer. There's nothing other than the grit on them. There's no other identification mark, so I apologize, but you should be able to find sanding pads, you know, online or at your local hobby shop that are similar to this. So we're starting out with the 3200 grit, and again, doing about 10 minutes Moving on to the next one. So this is 3600, and we're doing 10 minutes with this. And I'm really trying hard to make sure that I'm doing this in circular motions. You don't want to like maintain like straight lines because you can start creating grooves. Circular motions I have found to be the best. So here we got 4,000. Now we're moving up to 6,000. And you can start seeing here that the clear parts are starting to clean up a little bit. And we're getting there. So now we're up to 8,000. And again, so this is starting to look much better. And we're going to wrap this portion with the 12,000 grit. So this is like really polishing the plastic. And the actual plastic part, not necessarily the clear part, looks really nice. But the clear part still has kind of a slightly cloudy look to it. All right, so there's two more things we have to do now. So now we're going to switch to using what are called polishing compounds. So this is like what you would use to like polish, you know, very fine metals and things like that. So there's two kinds. There's a coarse and then a fine. So we're going to start out with the coarse. You apply the liquid on, and you can use different materials for actually doing the polishing. I'm just using a Q-tip just because the windows aren't that large, but you could use like a paper towel or something and just slowly work that in. And this is really going to help like level out any of those micro imperfections that might still be in the clear plastic. And then we're going to follow this up with the fine polishing compound. And this is really what's going to like wrap everything up. So again, and like I said before, doing about 10 minutes each level of this process. So, I mean, it takes a little while, like an hour, a little bit longer than an hour. But once you're done, I mean, we're pretty much back to just about crystal clear on this. And I couldn't be happier. I was really happy with how it looked. So now we're going to move on to building the nose section. And before I could do that, I had to cover up the holes where the little forward canards attach, because the way that they attach leaves huge gaps, and it's really ugly. And also, I learned something watching a video about the B1, that those aren't called canards, they're called smucks. And that's one of my new favorite words now. So we can get the cockpit and the wheel well installed. The fit here actually was pretty good. I mean, all things considered, you know, for the age of the kit, the fact that it sat in my garage for so long, I'm quite happy with how everything fit together. And so I use a little bit of tape to kind of secure the halves together, and then we can start gluing it. And now you'll notice here that the nose section is its own separate piece. The full body of the kit comes in three sections. There's the nose, the center fuselage, and then the tail, which actually kind of helps to break up the work because you can do just like one section at a time. And so we're just going to go through and get everything glued up. You can see our nice little flag there, and even with like the tinted window that goes on it, it's still rather prominent, which makes me happy here. So here I'm just cleaning up the inside of the canopy before I get it glued on. And the fit of the canopy was iffy. I had to do a little bit of trimming in order to get it to actually sit in there correctly. And we're also going to have to do a lot more polishing on this, just like we did with the side windows. But I'm not going to take you through that whole process again because it's literally just a repeat of what we already did. This top panel goes on. Now, it should be noted that on the real aircraft, it's not one giant panel like this. You do have the two hatches for the ejection seats, but the center portion needs to eventually get filled in. So here's just a little snapshot of cleaning up the front portion of the canopy. I masked off the side pieces, but you'll notice I actually sanded away the center strip. And I realized it would just be easier to sand that away and then restore it rather than trying to like sand around it. So what I ended up doing was mixing some white Tamiya putty with some Mr. Leveling thinner and masking off where the center portion would be, and then just applying the white putty up in layers to build up that center divide of the main canopy. And I'm sure there's probably other ways of doing this, but in my mind, this felt like a simple way of doing it without like necessarily having to go back and resand. You know, if I'd add like a strip of plastic there, for example, I'd have to resand and blend it in. This would be much easier to blend in, and I think it's pretty convincing for what it needs to be. So there we go. nose section has been largely sanded and filled. I will explain my sanding and filling process a little bit later on in the video. For now, just know that it's been done. So here you can see the smucks, as they are called, has that big like rectangular tab. And it just left this weird gap, and I couldn't get them to sit right. So what I decided was to fill in the slot on the fuselage with some plastic, and now I'm going to drill into the surface of here with a small drill bit, and then drill into the fuselage and pin it with some steel wire. And so this is, you have to be careful because you don't want to, you don't want that drill bit coming through the sides of the thin plastic of the smucks. But you need to get it in deep enough so that it actually has, some grip to it so that it can actually bite into the plastic and hold it properly. So here we're just trimming some steel wire, and don't worry, I'm not using my nice clippers for that. I'm using a pair of old clippers that I only use for doing, clipping wires and stuff like that. Another thing I wanted to add here in terms of detail was some rivet detail, just because, like I mentioned before, the nose area is going to be somewhat of a prominent feature of the aircraft, something where I assume if I take it to a show, it's an area that people will be looking at. So I wanted to have a little bit of detail in terms of rivet detail, because the rivets there are quite prominent in pictures that I've seen of the nose. So I just wanted to make sure that was added. So I'm just going around getting those added in, and here you can see how the smucks fit in. They just slot in like that. And so the other nice thing about doing this is it allows me to keep them separate from the nose during the rest of the assembly process and painting process, because knowing myself the way that I do, I know that they would eventually get knocked off. And so I was just like, I'll just avoid that altogether and leave them separate. Another thing I wanted to add here was just a little bit of detail for where the refueling door is. And so, like I said, I'd seen pictures where I got the idea for the flag, and the refueling receptacle on the nose of the B1 is rather prominent. So I wanted to make sure that got added in there. Now I am using some kit mask canopy masks for masking up the clear parts. And you'll notice that I have a little trouble here getting this applied on. That's not a fault of the mask itself. The mask itself is great, and you've seen me use them before. High quality stuff. I just really struggled with getting this lined up properly and getting it into the right position. So I do get there eventually, I promise. But I figured I'd show you that I don't get it right every time the first time. Sometimes I have to struggle my way through it, but once it's on, then it's on and it looks good. So, all right. Now, with the nose pretty much done, I'm going to start shifting my attention to the center portion of the aircraft, and that's going to include the landing gear. Now, when I originally started working on this 10 years ago, I was feeling pretty good because I added some brake line detail, but only to one of the main landing gear struts. I didn't add it to the second one for some reason. So here I'm trying to recreate the original work that I did so that it would match the first one I did. It's not super accurate, but and honestly, like, with the immense size of the B1 and the fact that the landing gear sits tucked in between the engine nacelles under this really wide flat body, this is definitely a detail you're probably not going to see unless I'm holding the kit up for you upside down and you're looking directly at the main landing gear, but I wanted it to match. So getting this detail added on there, pretty straightforward and simple, and just a matter of using your super glue, tacking it down in a couple of places and slowly working it from one end to the other. And now we can go ahead and finish up, assembling the rest of the main landing gear. This part that I'm adding on right now, so there's two pairs for each set of landing gear, and two sets of them had broke over time, just age or whatever, and so I had to repair those and get those applied on there, but in the end it worked out. So now I'm just recoating everything and reapplying a panel liner here. So nothing you haven't already seen before, but the main landing gear wheel box is very large, and in fact, the front or the back part of it doubles as the as part of the main or the rear bomb bay. So if just be aware that if you do plan on having this, ever building this kit with the bomb bay doors open, that's part of it. And so now we're just going to go up and clean those out. Moving on to the wings, one of the things that I wanted to do before actually tackling the wings themselves was get the lower half of the fuselage ready. There are a lot of openings in the lower half of the fuselage. You have the two forward bomb bays, you have the main wheel wells, and then you have the aft bomb bay. And that makes the underside center section of the fuselage really flimsy. And so I decided to install the bomb bays, install the bomb bay doors to help create some rigidity in this part. Additionally, I decided to install the main wheel well as well. And all of this just to create a much more rigid platform for when I start attaching the wings. And one of the things that I knew going into this build that I was going to be doing is I was going to make it so that the wings were permanently glued in one position. Now, you do have the option of having the wings move forward and backwards. The kit provides that. But I knew that the only way that this kit would fit in my display case is if the wings were in the fully swept back position. And so rather than playing around with just the nature of making the wings movable, because if you have the wings fully extended, there's an insert part that you have to put into the opening where the wings fold into to close that off. And I just didn't want to deal with like having a removable part, and scratch building that part. It's just, that was a hassle I wasn't wanting to deal with. And so I knew I was going to be gluing the wings in the closed back position. And so I wanted to have the fuselage stable and ready for that for when I was finished with the wings. Now, the wings are, for as big as the wings are, they are only two parts. It's just a top and a bottom half. And the fit is not great. And the seam line on the underside of the wing on the back side goes right down the middle of all of the flaps. And it's if you've seen my tractor video, same thing on the wings on those. It seems like a really odd place to put here. So here's that seam line. It just seems like a really odd place to put a seam line. So here you can see I am filling this thing. It's a fairly substantial gap, and I'm filling it with super glue. And I'm going to have to really grind that down in order to get that blended and smooth. But fortunately, the only panel lines it's crossing are just straight lines. And so restoring those panel lines I knew would be fairly simple. So here I'm starting with like 80 grit sandpaper just to really knock down that super glue. And so this is going to be kind of my overall process for filling and sanding on this kit going forward, where the gaps are very large, and so I'm using super glue as my gap filling agent, and then just really grinding it down with a low grit sandpaper. And then I start working my way up to like, here's like 250, 300 grit, and this is going to really start smoothing out all that that nasty sanding gouges. And I'm going to use this throughout the whole build, both cleaning up all the seam lines and filling and everything like that. So now I'm going to start polishing it, and I'm not going to go through the whole process of polishing like I did with the clear parts. Really, once I get to like the 1500 sandpaper and wet polishing with that, that's usually pretty good just for like the actual plastic itself. But it might look like there's still a gap there, but it's just because it's filled with clear super glue. I promise that it's pretty well filled in, but it does require a lot of sanding and a lot of polishing in order to get that to fully disappear. And so I probably spent like a full day working on one wing, and then the next day I had to work on the next wing. Here I'm restoring the panel lines. Fortunately, the panel lines are pretty few and far between, so it wasn't that big of an issue to get these, recut and restored. If I were going the route of like doing the wings extended and like the flaps and slats extended, there would be way more work involved in the wings themselves. But I wasn't gonna bother with that. Maybe another one on the second B1 I do. I'll go that route, but that's not anywhere close to now. So another thing that I wanted to do here was recreate the wingtip navigation lights. They're rather large and prominent, and the kit just has it. I mean, impressively enough, the kit actually has them outlined, but they are a full like clear piece, and so I decided to cut this part out from the plastic kit and recreate it using clear sprue and resin. So it's just a matter of time of just getting this all cut out and cleaned up in order for the next steps. It did take me a while. I need to get a bigger saw for things like that. That little saw doesn't it's kind of hard to cut through like straight up through plastic like that. So that's going to be a tool for future purchase. So here I've got a section of clear sprue, and this is not off of the B1 kit because the B1 kit, the clear sprue is tinted. This is off of just another kit, but I'm drilling this little hole here to act as the actual like light bulb that will get painted, and then the whole clear part will get blended in. So I'm trying to remove as much material as possible, and then I'm using some clear red here to paint inside that little hole that I drilled, and this will act as, you know, my light bulb, as it were. And I think the effect works out pretty good, and I've used this on stuff in the past, but nothing that I've ever actually shown on the channel yet, I don't think so. So we get that in, and then using our UV curing resin, we're going to use the resin essentially as the glue here to get that applied. I didn't want to use super glue because I didn't want to run the risk of fogging the clear parts, and I didn't want to use model cement because that would also create some weird effects on the inside. And so basically the clear UV resin will act as my glue. So once I set that under the UV lamp to cure for a while, and once that resin cures, it's rock hard, it's solid, so it sands just like any other resin, any other material basically. And so now I can really just start using the file here, and then I'll eventually switch to sandpapers to really kind of shape it out and blend it in to the rest of the wing. And this I do polish up like I did with the clear parts in the front. And again, I'm not going to show the whole process just because you don't need to see that all again, but you can see that I'm really using the file as to really shape it out, and then I come in with the sandpapers to kind of finesse and refine the shape and start polishing it up. So here we're moving to the sandpaper, and it takes a little while. It takes some time, and constantly checking to make sure that I'm getting it blended in, both top, bottom, and in terms of the shape. But once we're done, I think it is rather convincing, and I like the effect. So there we go. Navigation lights done. So apparently, obviously, I did this on the other side as well with the green light. But with the wings done, now we can start assembling the main fuselage. And you'll notice here that the wings are now slightly different shade of gray. That's because I did paint them with a gray primer just to check all of my seam lines and all of my panel lines. I will eventually prime everything black, but just so you know why it's painted differently. So I used a combination of the liquid cement and super glue to get the wing installed. I used the super glue on the main rotate, the pivot point there, just to get it in place, and then I glued everything around the perimeter with the liquid cement just for that good solid connection. And you can start really seeing just how big this kit is here, because I can't fit this whole, and this is just the center section, I can't fit the whole thing in frame. And it's a little bit later on in the video, once you actually see the thing fully assembled, you'll really start getting an appreciation for how unwieldy this kit is on the workbench. The seam lines here on this portion of the fuselage were really a pain to clean up. And again, it's just I kind of get why Revell chose to do it that way, because that way you don't have actual seam lines along the very edge back there, but it really made cleanup a challenge. But you can see here I've gone through and cleaned this up. This is filled, this is sanded and polished. I apologize for the out of focus shots there, but you can see that the rather large seam lines had to get filled and cleaned up. But I did get there in the end, again using just filling it with super glue and then coming in with that really rough grit to really knock it down and then moving our way up. So now we can move on to the tail section, and the tail section is relatively simple. You get two halves here, and then you have the tail planes, the tail cone. Now this is where we're going to be adding a lot of our resin from the Barracuda set. So the Revell kit does not accurately portray the back end of a modern B1. Namely, it's missing some sensors and the towed decoy arrays. And so the resin upgrades kind of help fill that in. But additionally, there are a bunch of vortex generators on the back end that are not represented in any other medium. So those will have to get scratch built on. So here's the Barracuda set with some of the sensors that we're going to be adding. You do get some sensors that you won't use on, or that I won't be using on the version that I'm building, because they're on even newer versions. The aircraft that I'm representing was in service in like the early 2000s. The most modern B1s have additional sensors and antennas that weren't present on that old one that I'm not using, but the Barracuda set does give them to you so that you can do a current up-to-date B1. So here we have to remove the casting blocks off of these pieces, and I'm just using my clippers. In hindsight, I should have been a little bit more careful because resin can be very brittle when using clippers like that, and clipping them can cause them to shatter. So just be aware that that is a possibility. Here we're getting the tail cone installed. This is just a simple fit on. And now we're going to start putting our sensors on. You can see the instruction sheet in the back, and it gives you like good dimensions on where these sensors are supposed to go. So, make sure you're measuring things out and getting them placed accurately. The fit on these was pretty good, pretty spot on. I did have to use a little bit of filler on the towed decoy arrays, but I mean, it really wasn't very much. And otherwise, trying to scratch build these parts on my own would have been extremely difficult. And so definitely recommend the Barracuda upgrade set if you plan on doing this kit, or at least representing a modern B1. And I say modern within the last 20 years. The kit is much more reminiscent of like the very initial B1, B-1B productions, and not anything that would have been used within the last 20, 25 years. So now we get the resin on. So these are the towed decoy arrays on the sides there. And now we can start doing the vortex generator. So I'm just cutting out some strip plastic here, and similar to what we used when we did the ladder. And now I'm going to start marking on the fuselage where the vortex generators go. Again, I'm using reference pictures, both that I took and off the internet, to mark these out. So when you see me pausing like this, it's because I'm looking at my computer screen off to the left just to make sure that I am getting this correctly. Unfortunately, the panel lines on the back end of the model here are fairly accurate, so it's easy to reference the panel lines on the actual aircraft compared to the model in order to get these generally in the correct spot. And now I am largely like eyeballing this, but I feel like in general they're pretty close. So there we have our marks. And with the marks down, we're going to go ahead and start cutting out. Fortunately, the vortex generators on the B1 are just rectangles. Nothing complex about the shape, so it's fairly easy to get these cut out and then installed on the marks that we made. So we can just get these glued on with the liquid cement. Pretty easy to do, which will give you a little bit of time to adjust and make sure that they're all aligned to each other. But this is one of those fun details, just like drilling out lightning holes on a part. Adding little details like this it's really easy, it's really straightforward, but is one of those things that like this is accessible to even beginner novice scale modelers, because we're literally just gluing little rectangles onto the fuselage, but it adds a huge level of like detail and dimension to the kit that is like well more worth the effort that it requires to install. So once we get them on, just a little bit more glue just to make sure everything is in position, and we have our vortex generators on. So easy upgrade, definitely worth doing, and it looks awesome. It's a great look for the aircraft. So with the tail section complete, we can move on to joining our 3 major sub-assemblies. So here I am applying some liquid cement to the joint, but it's definitely going to take a lot more than that. So as you can see here, that attaching the tail fit, or the tail section, to the center section of the fuselage, you can see there's a very large gap and step. And this was pretty much consistent between the tail section and the nose section. The fit here was awful. And all of the sanding and puttying work that I had to use on the wings, well, I'm going to have to use those here as well. And so using the liquid cement to kind of get things started, but then we fill those gaps with super glue, and then we have to go through the whole process of sanding that down, starting with like the 80 grit, and then working our way up, and then restoring all the lost panel lines and detail. And that was probably a good couple of nights to get to that point. But what that does allow me to do is now move on to the engine nacelles. And this is an area where the Revell kit did not really do a good job. So the overall profile of the front half of the engine nacelles is completely wrong. And fortunately, Barracuda offers a set that comes with the intakes and the correctly shaped intakes. And not only that, but they have those like side fences opened up, which is something you often see on parked B1s, as well as they come with FOD covers, which is nice because, again, you'll see those often on parked B1s. And then you can get the Barracuda set for the engine nozzles, which are fantastic. Now, there are other options out there if you want to do these upgrades. Barracuda just happened to be the one that was available to me, and in hindsight, I'm very pleased with how they turned out. But you can just see that the overall profile is so different between the Barracuda resin and the kit part. And so as I was trying to remove the intakes from the casting block, I have a little bit of a mishap here and shattered my cutting disc there. And I was pretty fortunate that I didn't hurt myself or damage the part at all, but kind of left me a little shaken, so I continued removing it with just clippers and sanding paper. You can see in the background there that I do eventually replace it, but sometimes when you have a little bit of a close call like that, sometimes it's just better just to not use it for a little while. But the kit does come with intake trunking. So if you wanted to display the intake trunking, you could. You would have to add all of the splitting vanes down the intake trunking if you had them open. But because I opted to use the FOD covers, I didn't worry about putting them into the actual nacelle, and I left that big chunk of casting block on the intake as well, just because I didn't need to remove it. Now, attaching it, I'm not doing this pretty or neatly because I know I'm going to end up having to do a lot of work around here. I just wanted to get enough super glue on there to get this thing on there secure and tight so that it wouldn't budge. And so while that's off curing, I can start working on the burner cans. And the Barracuda burner cans are absolutely amazing, both inside and out. The detail is superb and crisp and clean. Like I didn't find any defects or air bubbles in it. Like it was very, very nice. So my hat's off to Barracuda, because these burner cans just look absolutely gorgeous. And once you get them removed from their casting blocks, they fit well with the other components, look nice, and really do the part. Because the crazy thing is, so you get the burner cans and you get the an afterburner tube that fit in there like that. The kit has the afterburner flame holder ring like right in the burner can, and so this gives you like that proper depth in there. But they don't completely fit with inside the nacelle, so you do have to do some grinding here. And I also did a little bit of grinding on the outside of the afterburner tubes there in order to get these to fit properly. But once you thin the plastic down and thin the resin down a little bit, then they actually fit in really nicely, and just a huge upgrade, both front and back. The You will eventually I do have to blend in the outer ring of the resin into the plastic because that is all, on the real aircraft, that's all one piece, but that'll come later. So now we can move on to building up the actual burner cans themselves and adding all of the actuators. Fortunately, Barracuda does provide you with a fair amount of extra actuators because I ended up breaking a few, because removing them from the block is a little difficult, and then cleaning them up is even more difficult. So it took a little while, and I want to say that there were 14 actuators on each burner can, and then times 4. You can do the math. It's a lot of work to do the burner cans, but it's one of the things where the work is absolutely worth the end result because they just look so nice. Installing them, once you get the actuator out and clean, installing them is pretty easy. There's just like a little notch or slot that they go into on the feather, and then they slot down into that little notch on that back ring there. And I mean, that's it. It's pretty straightforward. So here they are all done up. Again, they look amazing and look really nice, and I can't wait to show them painted because they look even better painted than they do but you can see here how the fit looks really good and just really makes those engine nacelles pop. So in order to complete the look of the engine nacelle, we have to be able to match up the contours of the intake, the Barracuda intake, to the body of the engine nacelle. And so I chose to use some Milliput 2-part epoxy to do that. And the reason why I chose the Milliput is because it sands really easily and nicely, and you can get a really smooth finish out of it. And essentially I needed something that would be able to blend into and match the plastic as close as possible. And Milliput was pretty much the best choice here, in my opinion. I haven't used every type of like 2-part epoxy putty or similar products, but of the ones that I have used, this one would be the best option. So really, at this point, I'm just kind of like bulking out the transition between the intake and the body of the nacelle. And this is not going to be 100% accuracy. I wasn't even remotely worried about making sure that like it was the proper constant width all the way across and like the proper profile. It was really just making sure that I could get it blended in to make it look believable. You also have to remove these little bumps from the back end of the engine. They are not present on modern B1s, so just be aware that you will need to remove those. So we can begin. I let the Milliput cure overnight, so about 24 hours. And once it's cured, then it sands so beautifully. And so I'm using like a 80 grit sandpaper at this point to really like create the general shape and an overall blending of the Milliput. And then eventually I go in with higher and higher grit sandpapers in order to smooth it out and blend it out. But I was very impressed with how easy it sanded. It was just time consuming. I think I spent the better part of like 2 days per nacelle just sanding and blending. But you can see here that even just with that 80 grit, it sands down really nice and blends in pretty good. And that's not terribly unsmooth. And so it's just a matter of going around the whole profile of the nacelle, getting that all blended together, and making it look all seamless and uniform. I mentioned earlier that we do have to blend in the back ends, the resin part to the plastic part, and that was a little sketchy because the resin was actually really thin. That ring is really thin, and I ended up sanding it down a little bit too much in a couple places that caused it to crack. So later on in the video, when we get closer to seeing the completed thing, if you look closely at the back end of the engine nacelles, you'll see some of the areas where it cracked, and I really couldn't come up with a good fix for it, so I kind of left it. But just be aware that part is really thin, so if you are blending it in, just be careful with it. So we can continue on working on the front part, getting that all smoothed out and blended in, and kind of transitioning from the more squared off from the intake to the more rounded of the back end of the nacelle. Just takes a little bit of time. Here I've used a little bit of gray primer to start checking my work, and lo and behold, it needs some more work. So this was literally like my life for a week on these nacelles was just sanding, filling, priming, sanding, filling, priming, until they finally looked good. Once they were looking good, then I was able to rescribe and restore all the lost detail and make that all look nice. And so using this narrow strip of tape here was a good way to as a guide for my scribing tool to make sure that I was getting these lines mostly straight and looking clean and uniform. There were a number of panel lines that ended up filling in just kind of as a result of the milliput process on the bottom of the nacelle here, and I tried to restore them as best I could. There were some complex shapes in there, but ultimately I wasn't too concerned with those just because they are on the bottom of the aircraft and pretty much would never see them unless you're holding it upside down. So it was mainly just concentrating on the sides. And there is this gap in the nacelle plastic between the two engine nozzles that I was really struggling to fill and sand and clean up. And so ultimately I just decided to cover over it with just some really thin plastic. And so it really kind of a crude way of doing it, but eventually I got to where I needed it to be. And to get that gap filled and covered and essentially made seamless. The back ends of the nacelles are quite visible on the completed model. Whether you're looking at it from the top or the back or even just from the side, they are quite visible. So it was important to get this gap filled in and cleaned up. And I had to keep testing and trimming and testing and trimming, but eventually I got there and we can get that part filled in and eventually cleaned up and made to look nice. So that was a good solution for it there, get that cleaned up. But now we are at a point where everything is ready for paint. So a lot of the parts you'll see here do have gray primer on it, and that's mainly just because I was using that to check all of my work. I will eventually do a black primer for the actual painting, but this is about 4.5 weeks worth of work right here. The majority of the time spent on this model kit was sanding and filling and then repeating it multiple times over. But it was such a great feeling to get to this point. So moving on to the whole painting solution, the painting process. I primed everything with Mr. Surfacer 1500 black from the rattle can. And I decided to do this just because I knew it was going to be fast and easy. Trying to prime this all by airbrush was going to use up all my supply of Mr. Surfacer, and I found it easier to do it from the spray can. And to be fair to Mr. Hobby, their spray can Mr. Surfacer is very nice, and it comes out very smooth, very clean, and minimal buildup. So in the end, I was quite happy to do it this way, and I think it worked out well for such a large project. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to paint a couple areas white just to kind of get them out of the way since I have the white in the airbrush. So these are the FOD covers. I'm giving them a light base coat of white so that I can come back and paint red over them. And then the insides of the engines and the burner cans get painted white. I'm going to use the same process I used on the Academy F-15 engines. So if you've seen that video, this will be familiar to you, but just getting everything a nice good coat of white on the inside before moving on to what I essentially consider the first step of weathering, and that's doing a mottling coat. And this allows me to create variations in the actual color tone of the aircraft. With this being such a large model and such a big aircraft with a lot of surface area, I wanted to give it a paint job that would allow me to create as much surface variation as possible. And so my idea was to do a paint job of an aircraft that had been in theater for on deployment for a long time and had been baking out in the desert sun, and I really wanted the overall condition of the aircraft to represent that. And fortunately, I found some great reference pictures that I'll show you later on in the video that I was using as my guide for the whole painting and weathering process. But I really do consider this part as part of the weathering process because it helps create very subtle tonal variations in the paint scheme which helps overall give the effect of an aircraft that has like been out in the elements. But moving on, we can start moving on to gray. You're going to be seeing a lot of gray for the next little while. It's because the whole aircraft is painted gray. No one's ever accused the United States Air Force aircraft of being overly colorful. And I'm actually starting with a lighter gray than I actually want the end result to be. And I'm doing this on purpose because I want to be able to create a canvas that I can layer more paints on top of to give me those additional tonal variations, more than what the mottling layer will do. So I'm laying this on really thin, which gives me, you know, a lot of control over the opacity and how much of that mottling layer shows through. But it's just a matter of going over this whole thing, and this thing is massive. And one of the interesting things that one of the things I was worried about was, you know, like my airbrush hand getting cramped up from having to do such long airbrushing sessions. But in the end, it actually turned out that my hand holding the model, my left hand, got way more tired just because the model is so big, it's so heavy, and trying to manipulate it around my somewhat cramped workspace was a real challenge. And so that's the arm that ended up getting tired was the hand holding up the model. But you can really see just, I mean, there's no way I can even keep this thing in the whole thing in frame at any time. It's that big. And eventually, like now, I had to just set it down and give my left arm a break there because it was just getting so heavy. But yeah, I would do these airbrushing sessions like an hour and a half at a time. So now we can move on to the medium gunship. So this is going to be the grade that I eventually want to be as like my overall final color. And I'm going to start off with hitting the panel lines first, and then I'll start filling things in. But doing it this way just gives me a little bit of control over how much I want that underside layer to show through, to, you know, help sell the effect of paint fading and wear and tear. There would be ground crew on top of the aircraft. The chaff and flare buckets are actually located on top behind the cockpit, so there would be people up there walking, as well as like servicing the wing box area, the wing sweep mechanism. So there would be people up there. There would be a decent amount of wear and tear other than just, you know, sun damage kind of a thing. So I wanted to be able to control a lot of how much I varied the paint scheme. So here you can see the overall gunship grade has been applied, and you still see a lot of patchy stuff coming through. So now we're going to start hitting things with a dark gray. This is I'm going to be spraying on really thin and really concentrating along panel lines and areas that would have a lot more like fluid staining or maintenance grime and grease and things like that. So there's, you know, along the bottom of the engines where the engine panels would be open, where, you know, engine fluids would be leaking, along the wing box area where there'd be a lot of maintenance going on. So that's really what I was trying to do here. And again, I'm also using a couple of reference pictures to really guide this along as well. So I'm not like necessarily just I'm not making a lot of this up out of thin air. I was really trying hard to stick to what is actually seen on these aircraft. And so the process was very fun. It allowed me to be very creative, very, you know, I can't quite think of the right word, but just it really got those creative juices flowing and allowed me to look at things a little bit differently than I would normally in the weathering process. I really wanted to try and stay away from using oils as much as I could, and really rely on painting for the weathering. So here you can see I'm adding a lot of this around the flaps area. Some of the pictures I had really showed a lot of buildup around the flaps. Along the underside, especially around the engines, there was a lot of buildup, and around where like crew would be servicing the wing sweep area as well. So it was fun going around and adding this kind of like post shading. And again, coming off of the FW190, where I really felt good about the post shading I did on there. This, you know, that's what we're doing here. And then also a lot of this post shading represents like corrosion control. The you know, the ground crews would repaint over areas that were getting worn and losing its paint, and so the initial, or like the fresh paint, would be much darker than the faded paint. So here's the dark gray overall done, and I'm really happy with the effect here and where it's built up, and you can start seeing a lot of that grime. So now we're going to hit some sea gray on here, and I'm just going to use this to pick out a couple of random panels. So these panels along the leading edge of the the wing roots here packed with a lot of sensors under there, so it was always like slightly different color than the rest of the aircraft. So because it was a different material, so it would fade differently. So I wanted to make sure I was getting that picked out. And I mean, the difference is going to be really subtle, but I do like the overall more subtle look in the end, because it just, it allows you to keep discovering new things to look at. And then here we're just going to use a little bit of this medium Air Force, gray, again, just to kind of help define some of these other panels and just create a little bit more modularity in certain areas. And it's interesting. So this gray patch on the upper surface, this comes directly from one of my reference pictures. I just thought it was so interesting and unique that I had to replicate it. And I'm glad that I did, because it's a fun look, and it just makes it look different and sets it apart from other aircraft that I've done. So adding a little more variation to these panels here, and then finally just doing a little bit more corrosion control in certain areas with the lighter gray, just to help break things up a little bit. And in the end, I'm really pleased that even though this is like just an overall gray jet, that there is a lot of variation and tonal differences across the aircraft. So again, when you're doing something like this, check your references. Don't want to necessarily go outside the realm of reality, but this is definitely going to be like the more extreme end of what a weathered B1 would look like. This is probably not very common, but nonetheless, it's fun to look at, and it was fun to paint. So ultimately, that's why I decided to go down this route. And so here are the reference pictures that I was basically working off of. So you can see this was my main inspiration here, but again, you can see where a lot of like the fading would take place, and a lot of the weathering and accumulation of dirt and grime. Here you can see some of that corrosion control that I was mentioning earlier. So, and here is the flag inspiration that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. And now we're going to start using some NATO black to do all of our wing walkways. The original kit does provide decals for the walkways, but the original decals for this kit were beyond useless. And so it just made sense that I would paint these, because they're basically long straight lines. And so as far as masking goes, it wasn't going to be terribly difficult to do. Just a matter of, making sure it's all somewhat of a constant width, and you're pretty much good to go. Now, these are probably slightly oversized, larger than they should be, but in the end, it doesn't bother me that much. I like the look, and I'm pleased with how they turned out, mainly just because I was able to maintain straight lines, straight and consistent width lines, and it just painted markings generally always look better to me. So rather this than trying to like manhandle 2.5 feet of black straight line decals, this was just a better result in the end. So going over the wing walks, so they had wing walks on the main wings, on the tail, the horizontal stabilizers, and then around the chaff and flare buckets. So pretty happy with how these turned out. Masking came off with no problems and resulted in some very clean lines. It's always satisfying when you get nice clean masking like this, and it comes up clean without ripping off all your paintwork. That's definitely something that I've had happen before. So there we go. Walkway's all done, and I think they're looking pretty good. The overall effect is I'm pretty happy with in terms of the paint job. Now there is this there is this small spot on the tail that needs to get painted, and I assume this is some kind of radar warning receiver or something, but it was green, so I wanted to make sure I got that painted. And now we can do the nose cone as well. And if you haven't noticed yet, I've left the nose cone off, not just because I wanted to paint it separately, but because I needed to wait until the entire aircraft was assembled before I could put nose weight in to make sure that it wasn't a tail sitter. So that's the main reason why I left it off. Here I'm painting up the FOD covers for the engines. So just hitting this with some fire red from Vallejo over that white base, and pretty happy with how those looked. So with the bulk of the paintwork done, we can start moving on to some of the smaller details, like the burner cans here. So I've painted the inside white. Now I'm going to paint the outside steel. For this, I'm using the Vallejo steel. And I've found with these Vallejo metallics, they're actually really nice. I really like them. But you definitely have to spray them on nice and thin. They do not like being, blasted on and in heavy coats. You really have to work thin and multiple thin coats. But the result, I really like the result. I think they look really nice. And now with that exterior done, we can start doing the inside. So I'm using the Flory dark dirt wash on the inside. So just really loading the inside up, trying to get the wash in all those little nice details and crevices on the inside of the burner cans. And again, if you've seen my Academy F15 video, this will be pretty much a carbon copy of that. I was really pleased with the results. Doing the same thing here in the afterburner tubes, and really trying to get onto the flame holder there, and really get that in there. Now, these are fairly deep, and with the actual burner cans on, they're hard to see in there, but you definitely want to show it, as best you can. So now with a dampened Q-tip, we can start removing the excess. So I'm really trying to concentrate on removing it from the smooth surfaces, but really leaving it in those textured areas. And I think that really gives us a great overall effect. Just, to look like they've been used and they've got the soot build up in there. You could definitely take it a lot further. And this, if there was one place that you would really want to use oils, you could definitely do some wonderful work with oils. But I think overall, for the effect that I'm going for, I think the results are pretty nice. Definitely need to make sure to remove excess out of the afterburner tubes themselves. But here you can see test fitting these on. I think they look pretty good, especially up against the gray. Nice stark contrast there. So pretty good work on the blending job there to get those resin parts in, make it all look like one piece, and quite happy with how those turned out. And yeah, definitely looking the part in my opinion. So at this point we can move on to glossing and decals. And so for this we're going to be using my standard aqua gloss for the clear coat and spraying this on pretty heavy. There isn't a lot of tiny little surface detail to worry about on this, so I can lay this down in a pretty heavy coat, which is good because then I won't have to do it multiple times. But we're just going to go over the entire model. This pretty much finished off that bottle of clear coat to do the whole model. And it's interesting because you don't realize you can literally measure the square footage of this model in square feet. We're not talking like inches or centimeters or something like that. I mean, you literally measure it in square feet. That's how big it is. And so that requires a fair amount of paint and product and to get that all on there. And you just kind of forget just how much you need painting a project like this. But got there in the end and still had enough clear coat to do what we needed to do. But this is basically sealing in all of our work, all of that variation and modulation to the panel work, protect it all before we start adding our decals on and our final layers of weathering. Because even though I wanted to try and avoid oils as much as possible, there still are a few places where I will need to add oils as well as a panel wash. Now, the panel lines on this kit are large. They're very big, they're very deep, and not at all realistic, but in comparison to the size of the kit itself, I think they work. And to me, they're fine. I could understand someone maybe wanting to fill them in a little bit just to make them a little more shallow, but deep and wide panel lines have never necessarily been a huge detriment for me. I don't mind them that much. I know that there are modelers out there that is important to them, and that's totally valid. I get that. But for me, I wasn't too worried about that. But I did want to add a panel wash just to help define them just even a little bit more than they already are. And I mean, I think you could easily get away with not doing a panel wash on this kit, just like I said, because those panel lines are so deep, but I still wanted to do it anyways. It's part of my process, and it kind of feels weird not doing it. So I did choose to use some aftermarket decals for this, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do at the moment I saw them, because how often do you see a B1 with shark mouth on it? And I just thought it was so cool and unique, and it just coincided with the fact that we had a shark mouth group build going on my Discord server that this would be a perfect kit for. So it worked out great. And, you know, being Hammerhead model making, the shark mouth theme really kind of seemed to fit, and pretty pleased with it. Plus, it was just like, again, like I've mentioned a couple times before, I really wanted to try and add color to the very gray aircraft. And so even just having those those shark mouth decals on there, and the nice bright Kansas, you know, tail flash on there helps add a little bit of color to this thing, just because it's so big. So I'm just going through adding all my decals. Here's the ubiquitous shark mouth, and unfortunately the decals were quite fragile. I ended up breaking and tearing a few of them, and you'll see one later on that's quite a struggle. But even the shark mouth decals were, you know, finicky. They broke a couple times, and I had to really work them back into alignment. But I did get there eventually. And I think it's just the shark mouth on this gray aircraft really gives you the sense of like, you know, these are sharks, and I love it. And it made me so happy. Here you can see this decal breaking right now. So they got these cool, I don't know what you'd call them, robins, birds on the landing gear doors, and kind of a nice little. But the funny thing is, I actually installed these upside down. So and I didn't realize it until after I had coated back over them with a gloss coat. So there was pretty much no removing them, and because I had no spares, there was no replacing them. So technically, the nose landing gear doors are on upside down on the finished model, but don't tell anyone. I mean, once I got past the brittleness of the decals, they were actually really nice and really laid down with a layer of Solvaset. Really just disappeared into the paintwork. So in that respect, they are quite nice. There are a number of like unit emblems and badges on the side of the fuselage. And then finally, here is the worst decal experience of them all, was this decal to go on around the nose. And I mean, immediately you can see it starting to break. So I'm sitting here working on this like, oh, okay, I can deal with that. That's easy. That's just a couple of pieces, right? And then it's like, oh, there's more pieces. And it just kept getting worse. And so I don't even know, like, I don't know why I didn't just give up and throw this thing in the trash, but I was like, okay, I'm going to try and make this work. You know, it's just a bunch of straight lines, basically. I can make straight lines work. So I tried to get all the pieces on as best I could, and then start puzzling them back together. And I mean, obviously this footage is sped up, but I think the whole process probably took me a good 10 minutes of trying to get this put back together. And I got it like 98% of the way there. There was just a few that I couldn't really get to line up correctly, because it just, every time I'd push one, it would push others, and they would just all get out of alignment. And so eventually I just kind of had to get it close enough, and then touch up the few little spots by hand with some paint. So finally got that one done and out of the way. So now we're going to do our weathering, and for this we're going to start with a panel wash using my favorite Ammo MIG panel wash, the brown wash for dark green vehicles. So this just gets applied sparingly across all the panel lines here. Not necessarily sparingly. In fact, I flooded on a couple places here. So the opposite of sparingly, liberally, and to really help define some of these panel lines, and just make them a little more contrast with these. So just go around getting this all applied on. Pretty straightforward. And I mean, if you've seen any of my other videos, you've seen this done a bunch of times. Nothing new here, but just wanted to make sure I got all the way around, got everything all done. A lot of these side panels, it really helped to have the panel wash on some of these side panels, really help them pop and differentiate them from the overall like smooth body of the nose. It was less critical on the main fuselage just because there's way more panel lines there. But once it's dried, give it about 30 minutes to dry. Then we just come off with just a dry clean cloth, and we can wipe off all the excess. And if you try to like wipe in the direction of the airflow, you can kind of create some really subtle streaking, which just helps add to the weathering process, if that's a look that you might be going for. But you can see how nicely it cleans up. It's pretty simple stuff, and goes on easy and removes easy. So go around hitting all the rest of these spots here and getting it all cleaned up, ready for the next stage of weathering. The engines, I wanted to keep them a little bit more dirty and grimy, so I wasn't as thorough removing it off the engine nacelles. And also I knew like I'd be adding more weathering there in the future. So at this point, I'm hitting everything with the semi-gloss. And the reason why I chose semi-gloss as opposed to like a flat coat is just because even military aircraft still have like a sheen to them. And so I wanted to make sure that there's still a little bit of a shine left on this. It didn't need to be like glossy or ultra glossy. I still just wanted the light to pick up a little bit of a sheen. But then what it allowed me to do was to go in later, and you'll see this later on in the video, where I actually pick out other panels in a matte coat. And so I have different right here. So I have different areas that have different levels of sheen. So you're gonna have some shine in areas and then no shine in areas, and you'll be able to like get this patchwork. Again, kind of just goes towards the idea that this has been out in the sun baking in the desert, and not only is the paint fading, but the overall finish is being disrupted as well. So it's one of those very, very subtle things, and it really only works if you're changing the angle that you're viewing it from to kind of hit the light in a different way and see how the light bounces off in different areas. So that's really what I'm going for here in terms of the overall look. You can see that I'm trying to hit some like specific areas with the matte coat, specific panels, specific panel lines, areas where they did like corrosion repair, things like that. So at this point, I'm done spraying any kind of varnish, paint, or whatever. And so I can start removing the masking tape or the canopy masks to reveal our cool cockpit that we really can't see, but we can see that flag still. And so great work from Kit Mask on their canopy masks. They turned out great and did their job well. Here we can add the FOD covers to the engines. I did paint the 184th Bomb Wing logo on there by hand. Not great, but kind of still like the look of it. Get a good shot of that shark mouth. And now we're going to start doing some more weathering, this time using some lacquers. So this little portion in between the engine nacelles, I believe, is an auxiliary power unit. And so I've seen a couple pictures where there was some really heavy dark exhaust staining here. So that's what I'm using this black forest to start building up some nice like dark sooty exhaust here, and give that impression. And I also help use it to grime up some of the panel lines around here as well, and just start adding extra layer of weathering and detail to the overall paint job. And again, this is areas that no one's really going to be seeing even at a convention or a show, just because it's on the underside, and the engine nacelles sit pretty low to the ground, so even if you were trying to duck to look under, you really wouldn't see them. But we can start building up some of this stuff on the sides, but in the end, I know this there, and now all of you in internet land know it's there. So keeping it honest, doing a little bit more grime buildup around the swivel point on the wings. There was a lot of build up there. And it's like you'd see on like an F-14, for example. They have a lot of like grease and fluid buildup on the wing sweep area. So that's what I'm trying to do there. And the interestingly, the only places where I could ever find like chipping is these bottom portions of the intake. So they would have the paint would chip down to the zinc chromate primer, and this is the only place I could see in reference pictures where this would happen. So I don't know if it was common enough that they just couldn't keep up with corrosion control there, or what. But that was the only place where I could see chipping. So we added a little bit of zinc chromate chipping there, and now we can start moving on to oils. And so my normal oil process here is to flood my working area with thinner, and then we start adding in our oil paints, and then with a soft brush we're going to start blending in our oil paints, and this allows me to help build it up in layers so I can control just how strong I want the oil paints. But again, what I'm really trying to concentrate on here is areas where, at least from the pictures, I would assume that the ground crew is servicing the aircraft, so there's just a little bit more buildup along the wing box here. The panels that I'm applying paint to there, they actually lift up so they can access into like where the wings would fold into the fuselage there. So I imagine there's a lot of foot traffic there from the ground crew, and a lot of buildup there. So that's just what I'm adding here, and trying to get it blended in as good as possible. Just really trying to go, subtle this is definitely not a subtle paint job, but trying to go subtle with the oil paints is what I should say. And then just adding a little bit more, more defined streaking at this part of the wing, the wing sweep mechanism, where it would really, that grease would really be spreading, but in a much more, concentrated pattern. I had fun with that. And then more fluid leaks from the flaps here. Again, looking at the reference pictures and seeing where it was leaking fluid. This was a pretty common area, so it was fun trying to do this, because I had to you have to create the buildup and then create the streaking effect in essentially two different directions, because when the wings are fully extended, they're pretty much perpendicular to the direction of the airflow, and so you'd have it streaking one way, but then when they're fully swept back, they would be streaking in a different direction. So you kind of had to create two streaking patterns almost there. So now we're going to add some more oil streaks to the undersides of the engines, just create a little bit more grime down here, and pretty much similar to what we were doing up above, just helping to build up some of that dark that dark painting that we did earlier with the lacquers, and then eventually start doing some real streaking, just to kind of give the impression of leaking oil, leaking jet engine fluids. I'm not a jet engine mechanic, so I actually really don't know what they would be leaking. I assume it's oil and maybe fuel, not sure, but that's what I'm adding here. In my mind, it makes sense, even if I don't necessarily know exactly what I'm saying. But we're just applying the oil paint and then just streaking it back with a thinner damped brush to create those effects. And we'll just add a little bit more, dirt and build up along the inside of the wing rock area, and just to help create a little bit more variation in that paint job in that area, just create a little bit of dirt. I didn't necessarily want to go super dusty with this. One of the reference pictures I showed, you could see how much there was a lot of dust buildup. I didn't necessarily want to do dust, even though that probably would have been more accurate. But at this point, it's kind of just us putting everything together now, and it was kind of surreal getting to this point, because I knew that I was wrapping up, and I knew that the project was coming to an end. And we're literally like 12 years worth of progress here. And it was almost sad. I was excited. I was excited to actually have it done, but at the same time, I was like, well, I don't have this sitting in my stash anymore, looming over me, silently judging me for not finishing it. It'll now be done. But at the same time, I was really excited to be able to get this in the display case because it takes up so much room and it's just so much bigger than everything else. But I was impressed with just how robust the kit landing gear is. Like the main landing gear is solid, and I wasn't worried about the main landing gear being able to take the weight of the aircraft. It was mainly just the nose landing gear, but even then, it's actually in hindsight, it's pretty solid as well. So getting all that in, and then we can get the landing gear doors applied. I've seen pictures where they're both open and closed, and because I didn't do any like additional detailing in the wheel wells, I opted to have them just closed, and that way just less to have to look into, and it was pretty easy, and surprisingly they fit really well. And then these little pieces get glued onto those front struts, and the original locating tabs for those, at least on the one on the close to the bottom side, were gone. So now it's time to balance things out. So you can see right now it's actually sitting on its tail, and I slowly started adding very large fishing weights into this until it was resting on its nose wheel. And so this is why I left the nose cone off, was because I knew I would have to do this eventually, and it was just going to be the easiest way to do it. And there we go. So it's now resting on the nose wheel, but I added a few more weights just for good measure, just to be completely sure. And in the end, I'm quite glad that I did. But so you can see I have the tail planes on, not glued, and the engine nacelles on, just because I wanted to make sure that all of that weight in the back that would be on the finished kit was there. And now we can get the nose cone finally installed. And that was another point where I was like, okay, it's now really almost done getting that nose cone installed. Here we can get the tail planes officially installed. In a lot of the pictures I saw of parked B1s, the tail planes have a slight upward angle, and so I wanted to make sure I replicated that. It's very subtle. It's not like a huge sharp incline, but just enough that you can tell that they are inclined. So I wanted to make sure I got that represented there. And finally, it's time to install the engine nacelles. Now, because of all of the sanding and reprofiling and the new intakes I added, the original locating tabs that fit in those rectangular slots were long gone. And so just to make sure that I could get, that these engine nacelles would go on and stay on, I opted to use some 5-minute epoxy to do this, which is nice because it gives you plenty of time to position it into the correct place to get it just right before it fully cures. And so I wanted to make sure that I was getting these both in the right spot, even, correctly aligned, and the 5-minute epoxy was the best solution that I came up with. So getting these installed, and it's surprisingly how close they are to the main landing gear. I mean, they really just hug the main landing gear, but you can see how much that they kind of like cover up the main landing gear, so you'd be hard pressed to see them once they're on. There are a few antennas that I need to add that I waited till the very end to do, just because I knew, like with the smucks, I knew I would break them off if I tried to add them any sooner than the very end of the build. And in the background there, you can see the sniper pod. So I forgot to mention that earlier on in the build. The actual sniper pod itself is from Edward. It's a resin piece. And then the pylon is a specific B1 sniper pod pylon that I ordered off of online. I'll put a link down to it. I've been doing a lot of recording sessions lately. My brain's not working, but I'll put a link down to where you can get that. So that was a 3D printed piece that I ordered online, and in order to make that a more modern B1, to get that added on. So here I'm just adding the landing gear doors, and like I mentioned before, those side doors, the rectangular doors, those are actually upside down, but that's all right. Here we can do the actuators for the crew entry ladder. Those are kit parts. I didn't replace those because they pretty much look the part. And now we can get the ladder installed. This took a little bit of, could have used a third hand here, but I got it in the end. And just got to make sure we get it secure. And in the end, very, very happy with the boarding ladder. I really like how it turned out. Here we can get the sniper pod installed. and it just fits right on there. Here we can get the smucks installed. Again, one of my new favorite words. And I did eventually leave. I actually left these. I didn't glue these on just because I wanted to make sure that if I ever needed to reposition them or take them off for transport, I would be able to. But again, I'm really liking how everything is coming together with this kit. And the actual final stages of construction didn't really take that long because it's literally just adding all these little pieces. So these tan circle areas, I assume these are some kind of like satellite antenna or receiver or something. I had to cut those out of styrene. Those weren't part of the kit. And but they're very prominent on the reference pictures that I have, so I wanted to make sure they were represented and got these fins on. I don't know if these are antennas or some kind of like airflow device, but got those installed, and then got to do a little bit of chipping up here. So a lot of the pictures that I saw of the B1s, the nose, there's a lot of chipping up there from the refueling probe striking the aircraft skin, missing the receptacle, and causing a lot of paint scratching on there. So had fun just adding all my little scratches here. And then finally, the last detail I needed to do was the pitot tubes. Now, the kit provides you 2 pitot tubes, 1 for each side, but if you look at reference pictures, there's 3 on each side. And I tried looking around to see if anybody offered a replacement, and I couldn't find any. So ultimately, I bit the bullet and I designed my own in 3D in CAD software and 3D printed them. Now, I printed them in different sizes because I didn't know which size ultimately would fit right on the aircraft. So I printed them in 3 different sizes, painted them up, and then I would hold them up to see which one I looked the best. I ended up using the smallest ones. Those ones seemed to be just the right size. So I removed them from the little support plate there, and then just got to file them down. And I'm using a curved profile file here, so that actually gives a little bit of a curve to the concave curve to the inside of that pad, and it just helps it stick better onto the surface of the model. So that's just getting applied on with super glue. And I will have a picture here we go, of all of them put on. So I'm really pleased with my 3D designing and printing efforts here, and quite happy with how it turned out because it's much better than what the kit gave you. So that said, we are done. This is it. Here is the completed B1. So total time on this kit was 6.5 weeks. Like I mentioned earlier, most of that was sanding and filing, but it feels great to have this one done and to have this one in the display case now. I'm so pleased with how it came out, and I'm glad that I waited the 10 years until I was at a point in my model making journey that I could do this one justice. So if you've managed to sit through this 2-hour long video, you're a trooper, and I appreciate that. Thank you for watching. If you're not yet subscribed, please consider subscribing. I would appreciate it. Give the video a like. Let me know in the comments what you think. Tell me what you think, how I did, where I could improve, what I got wrong. Please, I love engaging with you in the comments. It really makes me happy. So please leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Like the video. Subscribe if you're not yet subscribed. And I'm just going to leave you with the final parting images of the B1. And I look forward to seeing you on the next build. Thank you, everyone. And I do need to give a final shout out to my patrons for supporting this channel. It's immensely appreciated. You guys are rock stars, and you really make it easy to help bring content like this to YouTube. And you guys are awesome. So thank you. You're all listed at the end of this video. I appreciate you. If you want to help support the channel, consider joining my Patreon. You get a lot of perks, including, you get to see these videos a week in advance without ads, other awesome tips and videos. So give it consider it, please. And we'll see you on the next video. Cheers.